Intel's i5-12400F is a fantastic mid-range option for anybody looking to get into PC gaming. But what is its upgradability? How far can we push the 12400F before it starts to create a bottleneck for our system? Stick around and find out. Alright guys, let's just get into some benchmarks right away here. We're going to be starting out with the 3050, and although the 12400F can easily handle this card without any bottleneck, I wanted to use it to show how, depending on the game and your settings, you can get wildly different results. The games I chose are my attempt at getting the best spread of different factors that can use up CPU resources as I could. Now, starting out with a basic game with no ray tracing or any frills, I'm using Red Dead Redemption 2. It runs pretty well at 1080p balanced preset. The way we can tell we aren't running in any kind of bottleneck from our CPU is that the GPU usage is pretty much pegged at 98 to 100% usage. The CPU usage also helps tell the story, and it sits at a pretty low 40 to 50% usage. Although, what can make the CPU usage unreliable is that most games won't use all the cores of your CPU. So, if you have a higher core count processor, it can show really low CPU usage, when in reality it's using like maybe even 100% of 2 to 4 of your cores. Let's check out a game with some light ray tracing next, like Spiderman Remastered. To start, I'm going to run the game at the high preset without ray tracing to take a look at our CPU usage. It sticks around the 40% range and occasionally gets into the 50s in certain areas. When we turn on high ray tracing though, we see the usage jump up to 50% range and even go up to the 60s pretty frequently, as ray tracing is a pretty CPU intensive task. DLSS is also CPU intensive, so when I turn that on with the balanced preset and very high ray tracing, we go up to 60% CPU usage and even get into the 70s. Once again, this is all to show that depending on your game settings, it can pretty drastically change the strain on your CPU. Moving on to a game like Cyberpunk, we once again turn on ultra ray tracing with DLSS at ultra performance. The CPU usage at points can get up to 80% usage with these settings on, but still, we aren't seeing any bottleneck on the GPU, as the entire time it was stuck at 98% usage. Last thing to talk about is competitive games. CSGO, Valorant, League of Legends, and Call of Duty will all require a lot out of your CPU to reach high FPS. I chose Call of Duty because it's the most GPU intensive game of all these, and will actually show if your CPU is causing a bottleneck in the stats of the benchmark, which is really nice. At 1080p, the 3050 does okay, but you can tell the 12400F can easily handle it, barely at 20% usage, and at the end screen, we can see it's a 99% GPU bottleneck to 1% CPU. Now that we have established all of that, let's start the actual testing. With the 3060 and all our other GPU benchmarks, we're going to use the 7700X as a reference because it's one of the best gaming CPUs on the market right now. So if the usage numbers aren't accurate in showing our bottleneck, the 7700X will better show when a bottleneck is occurring. One last thing to look out for is the 1% lows and frame time. Even if the GPU is running at 100% usage, sometimes the CPU can be struggling and lead to bad 1% lows and frame times, which can lead to a stuttery experience. One other thing to take note is RAM can also affect your frame time and 1% lows. Our 12400F has a basic kit of 2x8GB 3200MHz CL16 RAM, because I wanted a realistic setup for a low to mid-range build, while the 7700X has a much better DDR5 RAM kit with 6000MHz CL36 timings. So if it's just a small improvement that we are seeing, it's most likely the RAM. Starting with Red Dead Redemption 2, once again at 1080p max settings, both CPUs are running almost perfectly identical and keeping the GPU close to 100% usage, so no bottleneck yet. Moving on to Spiderman Remastered, the 12400F and 7700X once again look basically identical at 1080p with the very high preset. The FPS fluctuates a lot in this game, so it's hard to tell perfectly, but the 1% lows and frame time are really similar, so I suspect they're performing exactly the same. When we turn on very high ray tracing, it actually seems like the 12400F is doing a bit better surprisingly. The frame times are quite a bit more consistent, so overall it's really good performance, although I don't believe either CPU is causing any kind of a bottleneck. Looking at Modern Warfare 2 with the 1080p balanced preset for our competitive comparison, both CPUs look pretty close, but you can really see the 7700X shine here with better 1% lows and a really tight frame time. But it's still no bottleneck caused by the CPU. Last up for our 3060 benchmarks is Cyberpunk 2077. Starting at 1080p very high, the 12400F is doing worse, but it's hard to say why exactly, as it's still keeping the GPU at 98% usage, just like the 7700X is. Going down to 1080p high settings, both CPUs do almost exactly the same, with the 12400F only being about 2 FPS behind, so it really cannot be a CPU bottleneck that we were seeing. We will have to see if the very high settings in Cyberpunk continue to be a struggle for the 12400F, or if this is just a one-off. Going up to the nicer 3060 Ti, in Red Dead Redemption 2, both CPUs are once again really similar, keeping the GPU in the 95 to 99% usage range, although it does look like the 12400F is working harder for it, sitting at over 60% usage at times. Moving on with Spiderman Remastered, the 12400F seems to really struggle here with the very high ray tracing settings at 1080p, not being able to keep the GPU at 100% usage and lagging pretty far behind in FPS from the 7700X. The frame times and 1% low is also quite poor here as well. When we bump the settings down to 1080p very high, the 12400F fares a lot better, but we still see some dips on the GPU usage, and it can't quite reach the same high FPS as the 7700X, so we are starting to get a pretty bad bottleneck in this game in particular for the 12400F. Going to Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p Ultra, the 12400F once again does worse here, but it's not by much, and it's keeping the GPU usage at 98% the entire time, leading me to believe we are experiencing no bottleneck again. Bumping down the settings to high yields an identical experience where both CPUs are extremely similar and keep the GPU at a constant 98% usage. Going back to our competitive example with Modern Warfare 2 as the last benchmark for our 3060 Ti, we are once again running at 1080p balanced, and this time the CPUs look almost exactly identical, with the 7700X, I guess, arguably having slightly better 1% lows. The results shows a 1% CPU to GPU bottleneck for both CPUs once again. Let's make another GPU upgrade and go to the 3070. I'm going to start introducing some 1440p benchmarks now, as this is when I feel the graphics cards are more suited for it. So we are at the max settings in Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1440p, and both CPUs look almost exactly the same once again, keeping the GPU usage at almost 100% the entire time. Going down to 1080p isn't really any different. They both handle the 3070 very well and cause no bottleneck. Let's jump ahead this time to our competitive benchmark. Modern Warfare 2 at 1440p balanced settings is being run extremely well by both CPUs, keeping the usage at 99% the entire time and looking basically identical once again. Going down to 1080p balanced preset, the 12400F surprisingly again keeps up very well, looking almost exactly the same. No bottleneck here. Even at the end screen, we see 1% CPU to 99% GPU bottleneck. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, We are running the game at 1440p ultra settings, and we see about as minor of a difference here as we did in the other benchmarks. Both CPUs are keeping the GPU at a solid 98 to 99% usage the entire time. Going to Spiderman Remastered, the 12400F struggled pretty badly last time, and it continues here. We are at 1440p, very high ray tracing, and although it is keeping up in FPS, the frame times and 1% lows are really poor compared to the 7700X, and the 3070's GPU usage fluctuates downward pretty frequently with the 12400F as well. Going down to very high with the ray tracing turned off, the 12400F does much better, keeping neck and neck with the 7700X, and we no longer see the same GPU usage dips as we were before. Setting the resolution lower with 1080p very high ray tracing, once again it shows the 12400F struggling with much lower FPS compared to the 7700X and continued fluctuating GPU usage. Turning ray tracing off at 1080p does a lot better for the 12400F. It once again keeps up pretty well with the 7700X, and both CPUs occasionally have large dips, but sometimes that's just how this game is. It does seem like the 12400F may be a pretty poor ray tracing CPU, as every time we turn the ray tracing off, it seems to be doing just fine. Bumping up our GPU power once again with the 6800 XT now, I'm going to forego doing 1080p benchmarks except in Modern Warfare 2, because at this level I truly believe that no matter what CPU you have, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense cost-wise to stay at 1080p when you're at this level of GPU power. Keep in mind, also, this is just my opinion. You guys can do whatever you want, and I am honestly just trying to keep this video from running on for forever, as I'm going to start adding in some 4K benchmarks as well. And at 1080p, I'm going to be honest, the 12400F does start to bottleneck here anyways, so I just didn't figure the results were going to be that important, and there's a lot of other videos out there that will show some 1080p 12400F benchmarks if you're interested in those. So with that said, starting with Red Dead Redemption 2 at 4K max settings, the 12400F does great, keeping the GPU at close to 100% usage again and looking just like the 7700X. Going down to 1440p max settings is a pretty similar story. The 7700X barely has better 1% lows, but the 12400F is still not the bottleneck here at all. Switching over to Cyberpunk 2077 and running the game at 4K medium ray tracing, the 6800 XT can't really handle it, but I just wanted to see if the 12400F would still look worse even at this terribly low FPS, but both CPUs look exactly the same. At 4K Ultra, the 12400F does well here as well, showing no signs of bottlenecking the 6800 XT at all. Going down to 1440p with medium ray tracing is once again a similar story, so I'll save sounding like a broken record here. At 1440p ultra settings, we start to see a minor separation, but both CPUs are basically the same here as well, no bottleneck occurring. Hopefully the Modern Warfare 2 benchmark ends up being a little more interesting. We are starting at 1080p balance, and this is where we see the 7700X take a pretty decent lead. The 12400F can't keep the 6800 XT at 100% usage, and at the end of the benchmark it shows a 80% CPU to 20% CPU bottleneck for the 12400F. Going up to 1440p balance settings, we see the two CPUs performing almost exactly the same, and arguably the 12400F is doing very slightly better, which is quite surprising, but it's probably within a margin of error. Ending off with 4K balance preset, both CPUs once again look exactly the same, keeping at 99% GPU usage the entire time. Ending off our 6800 XT benchmarks with Spiderman Remastered, we are starting out at 4K, very high ray tracing, and both CPUs are basically indistinguishable here, with the 12400F keeping the 6800 XT maxed out, no bottleneck. Turning off ray tracing at 4K, the 12400F once again does very well, keeping the GPU usage close to 100% and looking basically the same as the 7700X. Going down to 1440p very high, we start to see the 12400F cause a slight bottleneck with the GPU usage fluctuating quite a bit, even though the FPS is still quite high and the performance isn't really too far off the 7700X. Turning very high ray tracing on, the 12400F actually once again does pretty well here, keeping the GPU maxed out and not falling very far behind the 7700X, except for maybe the 1% lows. Now we have the 4070 Ti benchmarks, and we are once again starting off with Red Dead Redemption 2 at 4K max settings, and just like all the other benchmarks, both CPUs show no signs of bottlenecking in this game at all. Going down to 1440p max settings, we finally see the 12400F falter a little bit, not being able to consistently keep the 4070 Ti at 100% usage and falling behind in FPS to the 7700X. Even though it was brief and only happened in the crowded market, the 1% lows are also a bit worse. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, we are starting with 4K medium ray tracing, and again, our GPU struggles here and both CPUs perform almost identical without causing any bottleneck. Going to 4K Ultra is a similar story, no kind of bottleneck happening here, both CPUs keeping the 4070 Ti close to 100% usage the entire time. Bumping down to 1440p medium ray tracing isn't much different. The 12400F is maybe 2 FPS behind the 7700X, but it still keeps the 4070 Ti at almost 100% usage. At 1440p Ultra, it's once again a maybe 2 FPS difference, but still no bottleneck, with the 12400F keeping it at a 98% GPU usage. Switching to our competitive title again, we are starting Modern Warfare 2 at 4K balanced settings, and both CPUs are putting out a high FPS experience, not showing any kind of bottleneck at all. Going down to 1440p balanced settings, once again, both CPUs are performing almost exactly the same and showing no signs of bottlenecking our 4070 Ti. The results screen does show a slight bottleneck on the 12400F, but it's 38% and I didn't notice it during the benchmark at all. Ending off with 1080p balanced preset, we finally see separation, just like last time where the 12400F can't quite manage a 240 plus FPS experience like the 7700X can. Although, even the 7700X is starting to show a slight bottleneck, being at 2% in the post screen, which admittedly isn't much at all, but the 12400F is at a 92% bottleneck. Lastly, we have Spiderman Remastered again, and starting with 4K very high ray tracing, the 12400F looks like it's keeping up once again. But the 1% lows and frame time are quite a bit worse compared to the 7700X, and we do see occasional dips again. Turning ray tracing off at 4K very high settings, the 12400F, just like the previous tests, does a lot better, but is still showing some signs of bottleneck, even though it's much more minor here. Going down to 1440p resolution with very high ray tracing, the 12400F is at a full bottleneck, not even getting close to 100% GPU usage here. Even the 7700X is kind of struggling, but it's not near as bad as the 12400F, even though both CPUs I would say are the bottleneck here. Turning ray tracing off at 1440p very high settings, both CPUs are still bottlenecking the 4070 Ti, but the 7700X is giving a much higher FPS experience and isn't quite as capped. The last GPU we are going to look at in our testing today is the 7900 XTX, with it being the highest end GPU I own. So, looking at our last set of Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmarks, we have a really interesting result in this one, and I feel like it's probably my error. For some reason, the preset quality settings don't work with the 7900 XTX, so I have to put them in manually, and I probably messed up a quality setting somewhere. But regardless, at 4K with high FPS, the 12400F doesn't show any bottleneck, and looking at the GPU usage of the 7700X, I would say that that's not causing a bottleneck either. Honestly, I think even if both of these were at the perfectly same setting, I'm almost positive at 4K they both wouldn't be causing a bottleneck in this game. Going down to 1440p, you're seeing a major bottleneck for the 12400F, where the 7900 XTX is stuck at 75% usage. Even though the FPS isn't that far off the 7700X, the 1% lows are drastically worse. Taking one last look at Cyberpunk with 4K medium ray tracing, we get the same results as the other times we ran it, seeing no bottleneck. Going down to 4K Ultra settings is a similar story. Both CPUs looking the exact same and both at 100% GPU usage. Going down to 1440p medium ray tracing, it's once again maybe a 2 FPS difference, with both CPUs keeping the 7900 XTX at 100% usage. Switching to 1440p Ultra, we see a larger separation between the two CPUs, even if it isn't that much still, although both are running the 7900 XTX at 100%, so I wouldn't call it a bottleneck for the 12400F. Looking at Modern Warfare 2 at 4K balanced, the 7700X again here looks much better, with much higher 1% lows and a 30 FPS average lead. Now, even though the 7900 XCX said it was at 100% usage for the 12400F, in the performance summary at the end, we see the 12400F have a 58% bottleneck. When we go down to 1440p, the difference is even more drastic, with the 7700X taking an almost 100 FPS lead over the 12400F, and the 7900 XCX sitting in the 80s in terms of its usage percentage. The summary shows a 98% bottleneck for the 12400F and a 38% bottleneck for the 7700X. Going to 1080p balanced, the 12400F doesn't do quite as bad, averaging close to 200 FPS, but still being quite behind the 7700X in terms of its 1% lows, but both CPUs are a huge bottleneck here. Now, ending all of this off with Spiderman Remastered, you're running the game at 4K very high ray tracing, and the 12400F does worse here, but not by a terrible amount. It keeps the 7900 XTX at 100% usage, but its 1% lows and average FPS are worse than the 7700X. Turning off ray tracing at 4K, the 12400F actually does quite well here too, looking actually almost the same as the 7700X for performance. Going down to 1440p very high ray tracing, the 12400F shows a pretty major bottleneck, not even getting close to the same FPS as the 7700X, and never keeping the 7900 XTX at even 90% usage, staying in the 80s. Ending off with 1440p very high settings, the ray tracing is turned off. Both CPUs provide a super high refresh rate experience, but once again, the 12400F is a pretty big bottleneck here, and although the 7700X is also kind of bottlenecking too, it consistently keeps the 7900 XTX in the 90% usage range, where the 12400F cannot. So, what's the conclusion with all this data? To me, by and large, if you're into single player experiences, over-indexing into your CPU makes no sense. You can easily get away with some of the highest end GPUs on the market at 1440p and 4K with a lower end CPU like the 12400F, but as you can tell by the 1080p testing in Modern Warfare 2, when we want those high frame rates in competitive titles, you start to really need the horsepower of a higher end CPU. Now, the 7700X rarely slaughtered the 12400F in almost every test, and just to reiterate, I left out most 1080p testing because I truly believe if you're searching out these higher end GPUs, playing at 1080p is an honest waste of money. I would much rather look to upgrade to a better 1440p monitor than look to upgrade my CPU, if that makes sense. The biggest struggling point for the 12400F was ray tracing, but it seemed pretty specific to Spiderman Remastered, as we didn't see the same kind of bottlenecking in a game like Cyberpunk 2077, but I would keep the poor ray tracing performance in mind if that is something you are heavily interested in. The best parts of the 12400F was the straight rasterized performance, which it kept up with the 7700X almost the entire time. I do hope this video helped you guys out to get a better understanding of what kind of bottleneck you will run into with the 12400F, and maybe it helps you save a buck on your next upgrade or PC build. Once again, it truly depends, guys, on what games you play, but for the most part, at higher resolutions and graphics quality settings, you'll be way more GPU bound than CPU bound. And I think most tests showed that the 7700X rarely beat out the 12400F at the higher resolutions because of that point. But that's really all I have for you guys today. Once again, I would just like to thank y'all for watching the video. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. In the comment section, I am really curious to see what you guys think about the results today. When I did my Ryzen 5 5600 bottleneck video, a lot of the results I saw were pretty clear cut, but it seems like the 12400F had some weird strong moments and weird hiccups in a lot of different instances, whether it was the graphics card in the system or certain settings being better than others. I just found that really interesting, and some people might point at it and be like, oh, it's because they have E-cores. One thing about the 12400F is that it actually doesn't have any E-cores like the 12600K or anything above that. So I'm not really sure what gave it such strange results, but I just would like to know what you guys think down below. Once again, thank you all for watching, guys, and I hope you all have a fantastic day.